In the oldest quarter of the kingdom, where streets curled like question marks around ancient wells, there stood a house with a balcony no one used anymore. It belonged to a bookbinder and his daughter, a quiet girl named Hélène. From that balcony, on clear nights, she could see the pale lights of the vampire king's distant castle, floating above the black line of the forest like a second moon. Hélène had been told since childhood that the lights meant danger, that if she stared too long, she would feel a chill on her neck and find herself walking, barefoot and dreaming, into the forest. But as she grew older, the lights took on another meaning. To her, they looked less like a threat and more like a lonely lantern someone had forgotten to blow out. The year she turned 19, the healers told her she had 7 days to live. It was not a sudden illness, and it was not a surprise. For many months she had been growing weaker, her breaths shorter, the color of her lips fading like ink washed too often. The healers were gentle with her. They said kind words and avoided looking at her father's eyes. They gave her herbs that would ease her pain but not change her fate. 7 days, Hélène repeated when they had gone, tasting the shape of the number. That's not long. Her father sat down hard on the wooden stool and covered his face, but she crossed the room slowly and placed a hand on his shoulder. She felt like she was comforting someone from very far away. 7 days can be full, she said softly. We must decide how to fill them. That night, while her father slept with his back against her door, as if he could bar death from entering, Hélène walked to the balcony. The cool air eased the weight on her chest, and the stars seemed nearer than they had ever been. The vampire king's castle lights shimmered faintly on the horizon. She found herself speaking toward that distant glow. I do not want to be afraid, she whispered. Not anymore. If I am to go, let me at least understand what it was I feared. Her voice carried into the night, thinner than smoke. In his high, candle-lit hall of stone and shadow, the vampire king felt it. He was called Oral, though few in the kingdom knew his name. They spoke of him as a creature of hunger and darkness, a collector of crimson vows, a ruler of the night who bound the dying to him for cruel purposes. What they did not know was that he had once had another name, another life, and a heart that had broken so quietly it had never learned how to mend. For uncounted years, death had come faithfully to his castle, walking beside him like a patient companion and taking those whose time had ripened. People died. Empires crumbled. Rivers changed their paths. Every soul was carried across the veil, and Oral learned not to reach out as they passed him, learned to stand still as a statue while the world flowed away. Long ago, in the earliest twilight of his vampiric reign, he had loved a mortal woman, soft-spoken, stubborn, always smelling faintly of wild thyme. She had chosen to live her brief human life rather than accept the cold eternity he could offer. She died in his arms as the first snow of winter fell, smiling up at him with a courage that made his own feel false and borrowed. After that, Oral had made a vow as terrible as it was quiet. He would not love again. Instead, he would devote his endless years to studying the border between life and death, searching for a way to ease the passage, to give mortals a gentler leaving. He invited the dying to his castle. The kingdom, frightened and superstitious, warped the truth into something simpler, that he married them for a dark ritual. In their stories, he was a monster who took brides and grooms on the eve of their last breath for his own gain. But in reality, those marriages were solemn pacts, symbols of guardianship. The dying came, sometimes fearful, sometimes curious, to spend their final days in a place where no one pretended they would recover. Oral listened to their regrets and wishes. He wrote their memories into books. He lit candles for them and sat in silence when silence was kinder than any speech. In the 7th night of the harvest month, when the air was clearing like a mind letting go of a dream, Oral heard Hélène's whisper cross the distance. It brushed against his thoughts, carrying the particular trembling note of someone who had accepted the idea of death, but not yet truly met it. He closed his eyes, and the world between them folded like silk. When Hélène opened her eyes again, she was no longer on her balcony. She was standing in a vast hall, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Candles burned in silver holders along the walls, their flames steady and golden. Frost traced delicate patterns on tall windows, though the air itself was not cold. At the far end of the hall, on a stone dais, stood a man draped in red velvet that caught the candlelight like embers. His hair, long and silver as moonlight on water, fell over his shoulders. His eyes were a deep, calm crimson, holding more memory than menace. There was a stillness to him that made the great hall feel smaller, as if he contained its silence within his chest. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice low and even, as if they were meeting not for the first time, but after a long interval. I didn't mean to come here," Hélène whispered, though some part of her knew that was not entirely true. She had called out into the night after all. "Am I dead?" "Not yet," the king replied. "Your body sleeps in your bed. Your father snores against your door. You are here in another way." Hélène's hand went instinctively to her chest. She could feel no heartbeat, yet she did not feel empty. "Are you?" She hesitated, feeling foolish for asking a question that had been answered in every fireside story she'd heard since childhood. "Are you the vampire king?" "I am." His lips curved in something that was almost a smile, but not quite. "And you are Hélène, daughter of the bookbinder." She blinked. "You know my name." "I have watched your father's house. I have watched you stand on the balcony and look toward my castle with more curiosity than fear. You speak to the sky when you think no one hears." He stepped down from the dais and approached her at an unhurried pace, the hem of his cloak whispering over the stone. "You said tonight that you did not wish to be afraid. That is why you are here." Hélène glanced around the hall. Its stones seemed ancient, but there was a kind of careful order in the arrangement of candles, flowers in vases along the walls, and chairs placed in small circles as if for intimate conversations. "What is this place?" she asked. "A house of last days," Oral answered. "Those whose time grows short sometimes come here if they wish. I offer them comfort, a witness to their departure. Sometimes, if they ask it, I marry them." Hélène frowned. Marry them, as in the stories, for some ritual. At that, he looked almost apologetic. "Stories grow teeth," he said. "People feared what they did not understand. A vow made at the edge of death has a certain power, that much is true. I bind myself to those who are leaving so they do not step into the dark alone. I keep their stories safe. It is not a ritual of dominance, but of remembrance." She studied his face, the quiet sincerity in it. Nothing in his posture suggested hunger, only a steady attentiveness, as if every breath she took mattered. "And why would you do that?" she asked softly. He did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his words were simple. "Because once," he said, "I could not save someone I loved. I could not make her stay, and I did not yet understand how to let her go. Since then, I have tried to learn." Hélène felt an unexpected ache for this ancient stranger. She thought of her father, of his trembling hands. She thought of the healers, of their helplessness. "How long," she asked, "have I truly got?" "In your world," Oral answered, 7 days. "Here, as long as we need for this conversation. Time flows differently in places that stand on thresholds." She nodded slowly. "If I marry you," she said, surprising herself with the calm in her own voice, "what will that mean for me?" "It will mean you are not alone," he replied. "I will walk beside you until the moment death comes. I will remember you when your name has faded elsewhere. And perhaps," he hesitated, as if weighing whether to speak a thought, "perhaps, in binding myself to you, I may learn something more of what it means to accept and release." Hélène looked up into his crimson eyes. There was no coercion there, no glitter of enchantment. He offered his question the way one might offer a seat by the fire, available but not insisted upon. She thought of 7 empty days and nights, of her father's sorrow pressing around her like fog, of her own fear like a small, lost animal in her ribs. Then she thought of this quiet hall, of candles and flowers, of someone who devoted eternity not to taking life, but to honoring its final footsteps. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "I will marry you." Oral inclined his head, not with triumph, but with something like gratitude. "Then let us begin with truth," he said. "I will send you back to your body for now. You may tell your father what you choose. In 2 nights' time, when the moon is almost full, I will come to your door. If you still wish it then, you will come with me. A vow made without the knowledge of loved ones can sour the heart." He reached out and lightly touched her brow with 2 cold fingers. The hall blurred. Hélène woke in her narrow bed, breathless, her father's familiar weight a solid warmth against the door. The room smelled of ink and leather, and the dried rosemary her grandmother had hung years before. For a moment she wondered if it had all been a dream, but the sensation of the great hall clung to her like a remembered melody. When morning came, she told her father everything. He listened silently, his knotted hands gripping the edge of the table. His eyes widened in fear at the mention of the vampire king, but as she described the hall of candles and the gentleness in Oral's voice, his expression changed. Not to eagerness or even relief, but to a kind of thoughtful sorrow. "I do not want you to go," he said at last. "Every day you are here, even if it is in pain, is a day I can sit beside you and hear you breathe." "I know," Hélène replied, taking his hand. "I do not want to go either, but I am going, whether we will it or not. The question is only where I shall be when it happens, and who will hold that moment with me." Tears shone in his eyes. "If I say no, will you stay?" She looked at him with a tenderness that seemed larger than her frail body. "If you say no," she said, "I will stay because your peace is also my concern. But Father, ever since they told me of the 7 days, death has been like a shadow at the end of every corridor. I would like to meet it in a place that understands what it is, a place that is not afraid to speak its name." He bowed his head and his shoulders shook. When he raised his face again, there was a resigned, aching courage there. "Then I will come with you to the door when he arrives," he said. "And if this king harms you, I will shout at him with all the anger of a very small, unimportant man." Hélène smiled, and the smile broke and became a laugh and then tears. They held each other a long time. On the second night, as promised, Oral came. He did not appear in a cloud of smoke or with thunder at his back. He knocked politely on the bookbinder's door. When Hélène's father opened it, the vampire king bowed his head. "Thank you for receiving me," he said. His voice in the small house was softer somehow, less like an echo and more like an ordinary sound. They shared a brief, respectful conversation. Oral did not try to persuade. He only answered questions. Hélène watched the lines around her father's mouth relax little by little as he realized this was not an arrogant tyrant, but a being whose gravity came from long years of listening. At last, her father turned to her. "Are you certain?" he asked. "No," she answered honestly, "but I am willing." He nodded once and kissed her forehead. "Then go, my heart. I will wait for your story when I see you again, wherever that may be." Hélène slipped her arm through Oral's offered one. The vampire king inclined his head in farewell to the bookbinder, and then the world tilted. They arrived not in the grand hall but in a smaller chamber high in the castle, its walls lined with shelves of books and jars of dried petals. A single large window looked out over the dark forest and the sleeping kingdom beyond. A bed with linen sheets and quilts stood near the fire, with a chair beside it and a small table set with tea. "This will be your room," Oral said. "If you still wish to proceed, we will hold the ceremony in the hall tomorrow at twilight. Until then, you may rest, or read, or ask me all the questions you have kept folded away." Hélène eased herself onto the bed, surprised at how light she suddenly felt. The air here was crisp but not biting, and every object had been placed with care. She ran her fingers along the quilt's stitching. "Did you make these things?" she asked. "Many of them," Oral replied. "Eternity can be heavy if one does not learn to sew or carve or bind books. Your father's craft is not unknown to me." The thought of the ancient king patiently stitching quilts made her smile. It seemed a good omen. The next day passed in a gentle rhythm. Hélène explored the quieter parts of the castle, always with Oral or one of his silent attendants nearby. She met others who were staying there for their own final days. An old woman who wanted simply to sleep without pretending she might wake stronger. A middle-aged man who spoke cheerfully of his childhood and cried when he thought no one saw. Oral greeted each briefly, not as a master but as a host. When evening came, Oral escorted Hélène to the great hall. Candles filled the space, their flames steady and golden. A few of the castle's attendants stood near the walls, bearing silent witness. Hélène's steps were slow but sure. At the center of the hall, beneath the highest point of the vaulted ceiling, waited a small wooden table with 2 unadorned silver rings and a book bound in pale leather. Oral turned to her. "I will say this once more," he murmured. "You may step away if you wish, even now." Hélène looked up at him. She saw, in the stillness of his face, a flicker of something fragile. Not fear exactly, but the vulnerability of a hope he did not want to name. "I do not wish to step away," she answered. "I wish to step toward." He inclined his head and took her hand in both of his. His skin was cool, but not cold. In a voice clear but unadorned, he spoke the vow he had spoken many times before, though it carried a weight unique to this moment. "Hélène, daughter of the bookbinder, I, Oral, who have stood too long between days and nights, vow to watch over your remaining hours. I will keep you company in your silence and your speech. I will remember your name when others forget. I ask for no obedience, no debt, only that you allow me to walk beside you until death comes to lead you onward." Hélène felt tears gather unbidden. When it was her turn, she searched herself for any trace of dread and found only a quiet, trembling courage. "Oral, king of the night," she said softly, "I, who have so few days left to offer, vow to share them with you. I will be honest with my fear and honest with my hope. I will not pretend to be brave when I am not, nor to be strong when I am tired. I ask for no miracles, only that you see me as I am and remember me kindly when I am gone." They placed the simple rings upon each other's fingers. Oral pressed his hand to the pale leather book, leaving no mark that mortal eyes could see, and then he guided Hélène to the chair beside the fire in the hall. The attendants drifted away like shadows, leaving them alone. The first night after their binding, Hélène did not die. Nor did she the next day, or the day after. At first, they both assumed that time in the castle was stretching her last days, as the threshold between worlds often did. But when a week had passed in the mortal kingdom, and the healers who had measured out her fate grew baffled, Hélène realized that something else was happening. She was still weak, her breath still caught in her chest if she laughed too long. Yet the steady downward slide into darkness had slowed, then stopped. Each morning she woke, surprised but undeniably alive. Oral watched her with increasing attention. He had seen many dying guests linger a day or two beyond what had been foretold, but never like this. It was as if the thread of her life had refused to thin further, tying itself stubbornly to the world. He began to search his vast memory for explanations, consulting texts he had written centuries apart, walking in the oldest chambers of his castle, where the very stones remembered the first vows he had ever spoken. Hélène, seeing his concern, touched his sleeve one evening. "If I am not dying," she said lightly, "I will surely never leave this chair again, if only to see what expression you will make next." He looked at her, startled, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was a brief sound, rusty from disuse, but it softened the set of his mouth. "You should have died a poet," he murmured. Perhaps I am not done deciding what I shall die as, she replied. He sobered, studying her face. In the flicker of the candlelight, a sharp, unfamiliar ache rose in him. You remind me of someone, he said before he could stop himself. Someone you bound yourself to, one of your guests. Earlier, he answered, his voice distant, when I was newly what I am, there was a woman. She lived in a village that no longer stands. Her hair was the color of autumn fields, her hands always stained with herbs. She laughed when I told her what I was. She chose death rather than joining me in this longevity. She said that every story is meaningful because it ends. Hélène listened intently. What was her name? She asked. He hesitated, then spoke it like a secret. Lysa. Hélène found something stirring in her chest at the sound. A warmth, like a memory that did not belong to her. That is a beautiful name, she said. Did you love her? I did, he replied simply. And when she died, I tried to hold on too tightly. I thought if I learned enough, if I bound myself to enough passing souls, I might discover a way to keep anyone I cared for from leaving. He fell silent, the echo of his confession lingering in the hall. Hélène watched him, the way his eyes had turned inward. Oral, she said softly, do you think that might be happening again, with me? He flinched almost imperceptibly. I am not claiming you, he said quickly. I have not tried to turn you or tether your soul. Whatever is happening, it is not by my will. I did not mean that, she replied. I meant, perhaps death has paused because there is something unfinished between you and those you could not let go of. He frowned, not in anger but in thought. Death does not make bargains, he murmured. It comes when it is time without malice or favor. Even so, Hélène said, I have not died, something is different. That night, when Hélène finally fell asleep, Oral walked alone to the highest tower of his castle. The wind tugged at his cloak. Above him, the stars watched with their slow, ancient patience. When will you come for her? He asked the darkness. Death answered, as it often did, not with words but with a feeling, a sense of quiet presence at his shoulder, as familiar as his own shadow. She is not yet mine, the presence seemed to say. Something holds her to you. Oral swallowed. If I have bound her unknowingly, tell me how to undo it. You have not bound her by force, the answer came, like a cool breeze across still water. She is awake in a way you are not. She has made a choice you have not yet dared. The words, though voiceless, struck him with the force of revelation. For so long, he had stood at the edge of other people's endings, believing himself separate from the currents that carried them away. He had forgotten that he, too, was part of the story, that his refusal to accept love or loss was itself a tether. He thought of Lysa, of the final moment when she had smiled and slipped away, leaving his arms empty. He thought of Hélène, alive against all expectation, her days stretching gently forward instead of collapsing. In that towering height between earth and sky, Oral understood. As long as he held himself outside the flow of time, treating love as something to be studied and loss as something to be managed, he could never truly help anyone cross the threshold with peace. And now, without intending to, he had drawn one more fragile life into his orbit, asking her to share her last days without offering his own vulnerability in return. He returned to Hélène's room just before dawn. She was awake, propped against pillows, watching the sky lighten through the window. When she saw his face, she knew some quiet storm had passed through him. What have you realized? She asked. He sat in the chair beside her bed, folding his hands. I have been selfish, he said. I believed that by standing apart, I could ease the suffering of others. But in truth, I have been afraid to feel what they feel. I asked you to marry me so you would not be alone in death, yet I have not been willing to be anything but alone in life. He met her eyes, his own steady but unguarded. Death told me that you are not his yet because something holds you to me. I believe that something is not a spell, but a question. Whether I will choose, finally, to love and let go. Hélène listened, her fingers resting lightly on the ring he had given her. She did not yet know the shape of her own feelings, only that when he entered a room, the air grew easier to breathe. "What do you wish to do?" she asked. He took a breath he did not physically need. "I wish to stop treating your life as a lesson," he said. "I wish to know you, not as another guest passing through my hall, but as Hélène. And I wish, when your time truly comes, be it soon or decades hence, to release you not with studied composure, but with honest grief." The words, though solemn, were not heavy. They felt like a door opening. "And if," Hélène said cautiously, "my time is not soon after all." "Then," Oral replied, a faint, almost shy smile forming at the corner of his mouth, "this castle will need more chairs." She laughed, and the sound filled the chamber like sunlight. In the days that followed, something in the atmosphere of the castle changed. Oral still sat with the dying, still listened to their stories and lit their candles, but he no longer stood apart. He spoke of his own fears when asked. He allowed himself to be moved openly by their words, rather than simply recording them in his unending memory. With Hélène, he walked the halls and gardens, pointing out small details he had previously overlooked. The crack in a stone that resembled a feather, the way ivy had grown around a forgotten statue as if in a slow embrace. She, in turn, told him of the smell of fresh ink in her father's shop, of the sound of market bells at dawn, of the comfort of a city's familiar noises. As her 7th day, and then her 10th, and then her 30th passed, the legend of the dying girl who had gone to the vampire king's castle and not died began to whisper its way through the kingdom. Some said he had stolen her soul. Others whispered that she was trapped in an endless half-life. But a few, usually those who had lost someone dear, allowed themselves a gentler thought. Perhaps, in that strange castle of candles and quiet vows, something had been mended that no healer could see. Years later, when the bookbinder grew old and his hands trembled too much to stitch spines, Hélène came home to care for him. She traveled between the city and the castle like someone crossing a familiar bridge. Oral visited the house openly, no longer only a distant rumor cloaked in fear, but a solemn, reserved figure whom children watched with round eyes and old women greeted with cautious nods. When at last the bookbinder's own 7 days were measured out, he chose to spend them in his daughter's company, in the house where he had bound his books and sung her to sleep. Oral sat with them both, not as a ruler overseeing a rite, but as family. When death came, it found not a terrified man clutching at his daughter's hand, but a father who could say, with tears and with peace, "I am ready." Hélène wept, and Oral wept with her. The pain was not lessened by his age or power, but it was cleaner somehow, unclouded by denial. The kingdom watched all this. They saw that the vampire king did not steal the dead, but honored them. They saw that a girl who had been promised 7 days now walked through markets and fields, thin but bright-eyed, her life not immortal but gently lengthened by some mystery. Some said she was the reincarnation of his first love, returned to heal the wound that had frozen his heart. Perhaps that was true. When Hélène asked him directly one evening, sitting together in the courtyard where lavender grew, he regarded her thoughtfully. "I do not know," he said. "Sometimes, when you tilt your head a certain way, I see Lysa's smile. Sometimes I hear her stubbornness in your questions. But you are also yourself, and that is more important than who you may have been." "Does it trouble you not knowing?" she asked. "It used to," he admitted. "Now it seems fitting. Love is not a puzzle to be solved, but a presence to be honored. Whether you are Lysa returned or simply Hélène, you are who I choose now to walk beside." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. In time, tales of the vampire king's castle changed. Parents still warned their children not to wander into the forest at night, but their stories carried less terror and more wonder. They spoke of a place where candles were lit for those who neared the end, where a quiet king listened to last words and did not flinch. And they spoke of the girl who had gone there to die and instead found herself living. Hélène never forgot that her life had been measured, once in single digits. She lived gently but fully, learning from each person who passed through the castle. She painted her memories onto the bare walls, coaxed music from instruments left untouched for centuries, and planted herbs in the courtyard soil. The air around her always held the faint scent of rosemary and thyme. One evening, many years later, when silver had begun to thread through her hair and lines had formed at the corners of her eyes from much laughter and some sorrow, Hélène sat with Aurel on the balcony of the castle. Below them, the forest whispered. Above, the stars burned in their slow, patient way. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" he said. "Marrying a girl who was meant to die in 7 days, and then spending so long watching her live." He considered this, the way one might consider a familiar book from a new angle. "I regret," he said finally, "only the centuries I spent refusing to take such a risk. Your 7 days taught me more than my 700 years. Because of you, I have learned that eternity is not measured in the length of life, but in the depth of each moment shared." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And because of you," she murmured, "I have learned that death is not a cliff to be pushed from, but a river to be crossed when one is ready to let the shore go." They sat in silence for a long time, breathing the same cool air. Death, who was never far from those who remembered him without fear, waited with the patience of a tide. He knew that, when Hélène's true last day came, she would not face it alone or bewildered, but with her hand in the hand of someone who had finally accepted that love and loss are not enemies, but intertwined threads in the same tapestry. It is said that, in that kingdom, people began to speak differently about their endings. They wrote letters, planted trees, made small, brave choices. They knew that somewhere in a castle of stone and candlelight lived a king who had married a dying girl, and that death, for reasons perhaps beyond any single understanding, had refused to take her when expected. Not out of defiance, but to give them all time to learn. That the heart's true power is not to cling to life at any cost, nor to run toward the dark in despair, but to stand quietly between the two, holding both. And if, sometimes on clear nights, you look up and see a light on a distant hill that seems too steady, too patient to be a simple lantern, you might remember this story. You might imagine a balcony, 2 figures seated close together, speaking softly of ink and herbs, of rivers and stars, of the courage to love fully in a world where everything ends. For in that legend, and perhaps in this world as well, the greatest miracle was not that the girl did not die when she was meant to, nor that the vampire king found a way to bend fate, but that both of them chose, at last, to live truthfully in the time they were given, and in doing so, quietly changed the heart of a kingdom.